Hi everyone, so in this video we are going to look at the civil rights development in the 1950s. So I'm going to focus on 4 different events. Some do go into the 1960s. And I've put just at the top here a table. Now, I'm not going to fill this in as we go along. I will refer to it and talk about what you might want to do in the different sections, but I would recommend that as I'm going through this, you create this table, be it on a piece of paper or on your phone or in a Word document. Obviously, whichever way you're choosing to make notes, if you are, just to kind of make sure that you've got the chronology of these different events, what happens in each of them, and the significance of them, which is really important. So what was the impact of each event and how did it contribute to the civil rights movement? Okay, so we're going to start with Brown versus Board of Education. Now, you may have heard this referred to. So this is in Kansas, and it's a lawsuit, and we'll see what it's about. So the Kansas's law gave cities with population over 15,000 the right to segregate their school systems, all right, which meant one school for Black children, one school for white children. They weren't allowed to attend the same schools. Now, this is a problem, obviously, for children. Well, it's a problem in general, but if you live closer to a white school and it's inconvenient for you to get to what would have been a Black school, we're seeing flaws in that system. And this is where the Brown versus Board of Education movement is born. So Topeka High School was integrated, Black and white pupils were mixed, as were the junior high schools, thanks to a Kansas Supreme Court decision from 1941 that found the segregation to be unequal. You kind of think they wouldn't need a court ruling for that, wouldn't you? So 9 years later, integration had not found its way to the elementary schools, which brought a lawsuit, right? They weren't abiding by this new equality law. So in 3rd grade, Linda Brown had to walk a mile to get to school, including crossing a railroad switchyard, which obviously is dangerous. She lived about 7 blocks from an all-white school. So this is what I was saying. If you've got to walk a mile in year 3, compared to walking a few blocks down, you can see how that doesn't really make sense. It had 18 neighborhood schools for white children, but only 4 schools for Black children. So we'd already seen 11 cases challenging segregation, but the Topeka chapter of the NAACP, so the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, that is still an organization, agreed to file a 12th, hopeful that this time they could overturn separate but equal in its entirety. So they weren't separate but equal, but that's what they were arguing. So the lawsuit was a last resort, but it was clearly needed. 13 parents, including Reverend Oliver Brown, on behalf of his daughters, Cheryl and Linda, signed up for the effort. So the case. They found that facilities provided for Black elementary schools in Topeka were largely equal to those provided to white students, reasoning that it was required to follow US Supreme Court precedents, validating separate but equal. They ruled in favor of the school board. So they said you have every right to remain as an all-white school. However, they found that segregation of white and colored children in public schools had a detrimental effect upon the colored children, and that the impact is greater when it has the sanction of law. So it was appealed, it was sent higher to the US Supreme Court and put together with other cases from other examples where this was happening, all under the name of Brown versus Board of Education. So that was the first case. That was what it was named after for whatever reason. By using a non-Southern state, lawyers could show that segregation was a national issue, not just a Southern issue. So they're trying to make it this wider thing. They're trying to destroy rather than enforce separate but equal. And they did, in 1954, unanimously rule in favor, right? So they said this is unconstitutional. We should not have separate but equal. We should have integrated. So they're saying it has a detrimental effect upon the colored children. And you can read that if you would like to pause at any time and go back over this. That's obviously absolutely fine. So if you're looking at your significant part of your table, it's has achieved substantial levels of desegregation, In 2001, the average Black student attended a school that was 51% white, not too different to our schools today. Even with its success, Topeka schools are following a national trend towards increasing segregation. So this is more modern day, not then. In 1991, Black students in Topeka were on average in schools with 59% whites. So we can see a downturn. That's obviously 20 odd years ago now, though. Sorry. Even with its high level of integration now, there is still a significant disparity, so a significant difference in the opportunities afforded to Topeka students. Black and Hispanic students are included in academic enrichment programs, but at a much lower rate than white children. Okay, so we still see a difference. And I think the most important thing that I know my students all have engraved into their brains, and something that you might want to write down about civil rights, is legislation does not reflect public opinion. And that, sorry, I don't know what is going on with this pen today. And what that means is, and we'll see that as we go throughout the course, just because the law has changed does not mean that people's attitudes have. So the law says, yes, you can be integrated, or yes, you should be integrated, but that does not mean that white people are like, oh, great, let's let all the Black people into our schools. It doesn't happen like that. People are intrinsically racist. And that's because they have always been, and that's all they know. And that's not making excuses for it, it's explaining it. That is the way that they know how to live. So we can't, just because the law has changed, expect people's attitudes and people's belief to change overnight. And it is still an ongoing battle, because America is still a racist society. And we have to, like I always say to my students, we're not born racist. Nobody is born racist. We learn it. And that's because it's so ingrained in culture that it becomes part of our everyday lives. And we just have to question that. So it's going to take a long time. And as we can see here, in 1991 to 2001, we still have this problem of some kind of segregation. Right, so a year later, so the first one was 1954. Now we've got 1955. We've got the murder of Emmett Till. There is a film coming out about this. So I'm recording this in December 22. There is a film coming out. I think it's just called Till, but I can't remember what it's called. But there is a film coming out about this. So if you are on this course, I'd recommend going and watching it in the cinema when you can. So he was born on the 25th of July, 1941, and murdered at the age of 14. So let's have a look why and what happened here. His crime was to whistle at a white girl and call her baby, right? So he's obviously flirting with this white girl. For his crime, he was beaten and had an eye gouged out. He was then shot through the head and thrown into a river with a 70-pound weight tied to his body with barbed wire. His body was in the river for 3 days before it was discovered and pulled out by 2 fishermen. Now, no matter how you look at that, that's not, the punishment does not fit the crime, does it? So let's have a look at what the situation was. We will never excuse it, but let's have a look at what why this happened. So he was raised in Chicago, a northern city, okay? And that's important in this. There was still strong racism against Black people, but there was no segregation, and the KKK was not strong. There was not the same vicious, unchecked persecution of Black people that there was in the southern states. So in 1955, he was sent to stay with his uncle Moses, who lived in Money, a small town in the state of Mississippi in the American South. So he goes from this northern, not unracist, but no laws against integration and so on, town to a southern town. It's completely different, and he would have to behave in a completely different way. Before he left, Emmett's mum warned him that life was very different to Chicago. She said to avoid white people because although he was able to speak fairly freely to white people in Chicago, Mississippi was still segregated. So he was aware that there was some differences between the North and the South. So he gets there and then he goes to the local shop with some boys who live near his uncle's and who he'd made friends with. The shop is owned by a white family, and it seems that Emmett had been telling the boys that in Chicago he could chat up white girls. The boys didn't believe him, and once in the shop, they dared him to flirt with Carolyn Bryant, who was the wife of the store owner. It's not clear what happened next. Some said that they saw him whistle and say, "Bye, baby," but he wasn't worried. She began telling people what had happened at the shop, and the story spread quickly. When her husband was told about the incident, he was furious. She exaggerated the story, saying that Emmett had grabbed her at the waist and asked for her for a date. So she's making it out to be more than it actually is. None of it was true. Oh, sorry. She also said that he used unprintable words. None of it was true, but Roy Bryant decided that he and his half-brother would teach the boy a lesson. And a few days later, they grabbed him and drove off with him. 3 days later, his body was found in the river and his corpse was nearly unrecognizable. He did have an initialed ring, and that's how they knew it was him. So they were arrested for kidnapping, and it did get national attention. Okay, now this is what we see as the civil rights movement develops, is we have more of a focus on these kinds of things happening nationally, and people start to question, why are they happening? But by no means for everyone. So his body was shipped back to Chicago, and they had an open casket, which means the coffin was open so that people could see what had happened to him. And people were shocked about the pictures of Emmett. And people in Mississippi resented the Northern criticism of Southern segregation. Okay, and they were put on trial before an all-white male jury. So you can see what this verdict is going to be. They had no witnesses because it was unheard of for a black man to accuse a white of committing a crime. His uncle stepped forward and he identified them as the men who had taken Emmett away. But it didn't make a difference, and they got a non-guilty verdict and they went free. So it does still, in your significance column, have a big impact. And people started to realize that this violence couldn't be ignored, and it couldn't just be you were in the North, you were safe, you were in the South, you were in danger. It could affect everybody. Okay, so the third one is the Montgomery bus boycott. Now, you may have heard this. It's probably the most famous in popular culture. So in 1955, African Americans were still required to sit at the back of city buses to give their seat to white riders in the front half of the bus. So African-American seamstress Rosa Parks was returning home from her job at a local department store, but she was seated in the front row of the colored section. When the white seat filled, the driver asked Parks to vacate her seat. The other African-American riders moved, but she refused. Now, there is a misconception about Rosa Parks, is that she was just this lady on her way home from work and she just got fed up. She wasn't. She was already very involved in the civil rights movement. So don't underestimate her involvement in this kind of thing already. So she was arrested and fined £10 even, plus $4 in court fees. Okay, so that's what I was talking about now. I'm not going to go through that bit, but you can read that bit. Now, the news of her arrest makes people angry and they decide to do something about it. So Black ministers announced a boycott. So a boycott is when you don't do something. So Black people are refusing to ride the buses, okay, in Montgomery. Approximately 40,000 African-American bus riders, the majority of the city's of Black bus riders, boycotted the system the next day. They met to discuss it, and they said that they raised their demands. Initially, these did not include changing the segregation laws. Merely, they demanded courtesy, so politeness, the hiring of black drivers, and a first come first seated policy with whites entering and filling seats from the front and African Americans from the rear. However, they wanted in the end to have the segregated laws invalidated. So the problem here is for the bus company is obviously you either meet their demands or you lose a lot of money. So that, and that's what it comes down to. So black residents choosing to simply walk, and they regularly organise mass meetings. So on the 5th of June 1956, they ruled that any law requiring racially segregated seats on buses violates the amendment to the Constitution, and therefore the boycott ended on the 21st of December 1956, and it had lasted 381 days. So this isn't like we're not going on the buses for a week. This is over a year. So the bus companies are obviously losing a lot of money during this time. So snipers begin firing into buses, and one shattered both legs of a pregnant African-American passenger. In January 1957, 4 black churches were bombed. So we can see there's a lot of negative reaction to this because people don't like it, as we were saying earlier. So it does put Martin Luther King in the spotlight. He is one of the key organizers of this. And as we'll go on to see in the 1960s, he makes a massive difference in the civil rights campaign. And finally, we have got Little Rock. Now, Little Rock is, again, if you use the AQA textbooks for this, the Oxford University Press textbooks, it's the picture on the front of that is Little Rock. It's a black girl with sunglasses walking down with books in her hand, and I got a copy of it up there. I think I have actually. Let's see. This one, yeah. So this picture here, this is Little Rock. You can see there a black woman walking down holding books, and then these white girls in the background looking at her absolutely enraged. Okay, so if you just Google Little Rock, that picture will come up. So we have 9 students who are registering in Little Rock, Arkansas, in the southern states, to be the first African Americans to attend Central High School, which opened in 1927 and had been previously all white. So we've got 9 students. The ones who were still alive when Barack Obama was inaugurated, he gave medals to, or he acknowledged them anyway in some way. So they had been recruited to go to this school as the first black people. The NAACP carefully checked the group of students and determined they all possessed the strength and determination to face the discrimination they would, face the resistance they would encounter. So there was no, again, like, we're making this free for black people to join now, everyone's going to be fine with it. They knew that there would be some resistance, so they had to be prepared for it. So they had intensive counselling sessions, guiding them on what to expect once classes began and how to respond to anticipated hostile situations. The group came to be known as the Little Rock Nine. So the governor of Arkansas announced that he would call in the Arkansas National Guard to prevent the African Americans going in. So the governor of the area where this school is says, I am not going to physically allow you. I'm going to get the National Guard to come and stop you physically from getting into this school, even though the law has said that they have to be able to go into that school. So we can see this isn't going to be an easy thing. In a televised address, he insisted that violence and bloodshed might break out if black students were allowed to enter the school. So he's saying, look, I'm protecting my students because otherwise there is going to be a lot of violence. So they arrived for the first day of school on the 4th of September 1957. 8 arrived together. However, one arrived on her own. Eckford arrived on her own. So they ultimately prevented any of them from entering the high school. And this is the photograph that I'm talking about on the front of the book. So her notebook in hand, approaching the school as a crowd of hostile and screaming white students and adults surround her. So one of the women spat on her. This was printed and broadcast widely. So similar to the Emmett Till pictures, it's making everybody aware of what's going on. And again, this gets international attention because of that. So they do have legal proceedings against this governor for bringing in the National Guard, and they do tell him to remove them and let them enter the school. So the police department takes over to maintain order, and they escort them into the school on the 29th of September. And there is an angry mob of 1,000 white protesters gathered outside. So people are still protesting this, even though it is perfectly legal. So President Eisenhower sends 1,200 members of the army there to make sure that this doesn't escalate, and they start to attend their full first day of classes on the 25th of September. So we've got legal challenges again and again against this, saying how can this be legal? But we have to start somewhere, don't we, with this integration. So we've got routine harassment and even violence throughout the rest of the year. So one of the mothers was fired from her job when she refused to remove her daughter from the school. So again, support from the white people against the black people in the community. But on May the 25th, 1958, we do have a graduate of Central High who was black, so the first ever. So there is aftermath to this. So the governor doesn't give up. He does close all Little Rocks High School for the entire year to prevent African American attendance, and they voted 19,470 to 7,561 against integration, and the schools remain closed. So they do complete their high school careers via correspondence or somewhere else. Okay, so they do manage to get their education, but not necessarily at that high school because it does remain shut. So they then go on to have significant good careers, and they have a significant role in the civil rights history. Okay, so if we go back up then, I'll put this table back on if you didn't have a chance at the beginning to have a look and to note that down. And if you want to rewind the video at any point and rewatch any part of it, you can pause it and make some more notes. But that's how the 1950s progresses. So in the next video, I'm going to be focusing on the 1960s, Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. So please join me there. Thank you.